From Chicago, welcome to 3Degrees Discussions. I'm your host, Mike Vasquez. This is a podcast devoted to the stories behind the innovators, entrepreneurs, and leaders in the 3D printing industry.
For us, when we get a part, let's say it's an additive manufacturer's spine cage, or if it's a prosthetic or something like that, it's important to understand that backstory. What is the indication? How's it going to be used? Is there anything else out there with the market? Why are you designing it this way? Why are you testing this? Why are you looking at this? If we just get something that said, go run us a tensile test, like we can do that and provide results. We do that all the time. But to really sort of leverage the value that Element can bring, I had the privilege of seeing everyone's technology come across my desk and be able to say, look, this is working, this isn't working. It's more of a kind of a trusted R&D partner.
That was Maciej Jakucki. Maciej is the medical device testing manager for Element Materials. Element is one of the world's leaders in material qualification and product testing. He joins the show today to talk about the ways that Element and their customers are approaching validation of 3D printing processes, especially in the medical space. Before we get started, head over to www.3degreescompany.com and subscribe to the podcast. Remember, you can listen to the show anywhere you download your podcasts, including Spotify, Apple, Amazon, or Stitcher. All right, Maciej, welcome to the show. For those of us in the audience or kind of listeners who are kind of getting familiar with Element and kind of the company, do you want to start with a bit of an intro about kind of both the company and kind of what you do for Element?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here on the show, and hopefully I can share some information and tell you a bit about what we're doing in the additive space. So Element is a global testing, inspection, and certification company. So we do a lot of work within 5 core sectors: aerospace, transportation, and industrials, life sciences, which is the group that I'm a part of, connected technologies, and fire and building products. And essentially, as a sort of third-party trusted partner, we provide testing services for all those different industries. So that can range, from basic materials testing, tensils, chemistries, metallography, to full blown-out product qualification testing. We're actually evaluating the final finished products, whether they're cast or forged, or whether they're, injection molded, or whatever the type of product is across those 5 types of sectors. So some of the things that we do that are unique. We'll do bird strike testing we've got a large cannon down in our Florida facility that will, launch birds into sort of simulate, a cockpit or a kind of an engine failure.
Are those like frozen chickens or turkeys?
So you can't use frozen, because if you use frozen, it's going to be like a missile, right? It's just going to go straight through it. So everything is thawed out. But there's lots of different sizes, and that's something that's kind of a unique capability we have down there. I actually haven't seen it in person, but I'd love to be able to go down there and see it. We'll do a lot of pharmaceutical and drug development support. Our connected technologies group does a lot of work with cell phones and wireless devices, all the things that we're using on sort of a day-to-day basis. We have flame-throwing robots for flammability testing. And so what I like to tell people is, if it can be broken, kind of like Mythbusters back in the, that's something that we can do. And then ultimately our product is our test reports. And what we do is we can certify or provide evidence that, this is the data for this particular test. And then that gets submitted for the different regulatory bodies. It might go to FAA, it might go to the EPA, it might go to the FDA within the medical space. So, what else can I tell you about Element? So some of the work that I guess I'm involved with specifically. So we created a new life sciences division to sort of carve out that piece of our business. And I'm involved in testing the medical device side of it. So I have a background in biomedical engineering, primarily in orthopedics and cardiovascular. And so we'll take things like knee replacements, hip replacements, spinal hardware, where a lot of the additive work is being done, and we will evaluate them either against predicate devices or against published literature, and try to understand, can they withstand the physiological forces. And then kind of beyond that, we also touch on like implantable diagnostic and therapeutic products. So we'll do something like a pulse oximeter, for example, or a ventilator, or a defibrillator, something like that. and we'll evaluate to the whole sort of electrical product safety. So IEC 60601, wireless coexistence, electromagnetic compliance, interference, and that type of work. So pretty comprehensive testing product offering across all the different industries that we're in. One of the things that's maybe relevant, kind of, we'll talk about. One of our recent acquisitions actually has sort of live COVID strains that we're doing a lot of antimicrobial, sort of virucidal, disinfectant testing. Imagine, you go to a restaurant, you go anywhere, they're spraying stuff down, right? The cleaning products aisle in your local grocery store is just blowing up because everyone's buying hand sanitizer and sprays or whatever it is. But a lot of that type of work is coming through per EPA regulations, and we've got a biosafety level 3 lab up in our Minneapolis facility. So again, pretty diverse set of testing offering across the board. My role there specifically, my title is medical device testing manager, which is really a very generic title, but I'm kind of a hybrid role between a technical director as well as strategic business development. So I support a commercial team. My job really is to talk to our customers and try to understand, how do we take this comprehensive offering? How does it apply to our customers in sort of a one-stop shop mentality? So because we can do so much of the testing as a part of that product lifecycle development, I think there's a lot of potential for us to be able to partner with our customers. And as we've carved off this new life sciences group, it's really doing well. And we've had a lot of positive conversations. In fact, I was on a call earlier today about multiple sort of new capabilities that our customers didn't know that we had. And hopefully that results in some new work for us, but also just sort of the Element approach to life sciences in this industry. So that's a bit about Element, a little bit about what I do there.
Right on. And so when we kind of get into 3D printing and additive manufacturing, it's kind of an ecosystem where some of the standards are established. I mean, you can do tensile. I mean, that's an established test, and ASTM and ISO. I mean, people know how to do that. But a lot of the challenges in additive manufacturing, at least from what I observed, is like people's understanding of how do we set up the design of experiments. Like anyone could get a number, right? Like I make you a bar, like you guys will tell me what that strength is, like, or something like that. But it's really like, what's the comprehensive story around what does that mean? And so how much of that do you play in kind of your current role working with some of these emerging technologies like 3D printing and medical and prosthetics, where like the testing is, it's not ambiguous is probably the wrong word, but it's like you need context around what you're testing, for both parties, right? The certifier and you probably as an Element is testing it, right? Like having some idea of like, what is this is likely helpful to explain some results.
Yeah, it's tough. That's probably maybe the toughest part that we have, because companies are all different. They're all trying to do different things. They have different cultures. They have different ideas of how they're going about it. Some know what they're doing. Some don't know what they're doing. Some think that they know what they're doing, right? And inevitably, for us, when we get a part, let's say it's an additive manufactured spine cage, or if it's a prosthetic or something like that, it's important to understand that backstory. What is the indication? How's it going to be used? Is there anything else out there we can market? Why are you designing it this way? Why are you testing this? Why are you looking at this? If we just get something that said, go run us a tensile test, like we can do that and provide results. We do that all the time. But to really sort of leverage the value that Element can bring, I had the privilege of seeing everyone's technology come across my desk and be able to say, look, this is working, this isn't working. It's more of a kind of a trusted R&D partner. But it's a challenge, because if we don't have that background, we're just providing test results. And so sort of the flip side of that is, I think there's a challenge in the industry overall of just knowing what to do, right? And so some of the things that we'll do is try to guide our customers along and say, look, this is, first of all, let's take a look at what standards are out there. And it's always a surprise to me, because the question that I get is, well, what's the bare minimum that I need to do to test it? And really, to me, that's the wrong question. The question is what risks do I have, and how do I mitigate those risks, as opposed to just sort of meeting the bare minimum? Because when you ask that question, there isn't necessarily a bare minimum. You have to define that yourself. And so we see in some cases customers will do exhaustive qualifications around their additive products, and typically they get better data, better results. But if you're kind of doing the bare minimum, that becomes difficult. But back to my original point, I think that I'm surprised by how many people don't even realize what exists from a standards perspective. So whether it's technical guidance documents, whether it is participation in F42 ASTM or the Additive Manufacturing Center of Excellence, it's something that I'm always recommending. And I feel like I keep saying the same thing over and over and over again. But day to day, I'm surprised. I get questions saying, "Hey, tell me about orientation of parts in my build plate, and how do I decide what's worst case, or how do I decide how to do that?" It's like, well, have you read the guidance? Have you looked at the specs? Did you realize that there's specs in progress that are specific around orientation? Now, they're not going to give you exact information for your particular configuration, but between, in general, if you're asking these questions around validation, if you're asking these questions around process control, how many parts to test, where do I test them, what shape and geometries do I test? I've never seen this before. And I guess maybe from a materials perspective, there's a lot of resources available to at least get yourself educated. At a minimum, go pay the $75 and get the emails delivered to your inbox, right, about the things that are ongoing, the different committees. And then if the standards don't help, then you really start taking a look at the literature. But you have to think about it and say, okay, well, what are we trying to accomplish here? How do we expect this to fail? So you sort of have the materials part, and then you also have the design sort of final product. And usually, if you can, partner with someone like Element that has a lot of experience, if you take a look at that part and understand what is it intending to do, what problems are we having, you can design a lot of custom protocols that will go and get that data for you in order to support that claim that you are or are not making.
For sure. And it's a cost thing as well, because there's so much in the additive manufacturing industry is not static, right? Even like take a single metal polymer or metal powder-based system, right? Like if you can do a couple builds today, send the tensile bars or density cubes to you guys, get tested, you do that 6 months or 12 months from now, or change something up, laser scan strategies or something like that, the test results might be different. And so having that dialogue between, okay, what's the intent? Are you trying to certify a single machine or a single part, a system or a fleet of machines? Like the test protocols look much different depending on what you're doing.
What's interesting about that as well is, I think that there's inherent part variability. You're going to get that in traditionally manufactured materials, let alone as well as in additive. And we see it in the test results where, the numbers might be a little bit more scattered. It depends on whether you're testing sort of a as printed part versus a fully finished part. And are you, if you're printing a tensile bar, 3D printing a tensile bar and expecting it to stick it on the frame and run it versus printing a block and machining it out, that's different, right? And I think that we've seen tensile bars that are supposed to be straight, and then they look like this as they're coming off, sort of that, or you put them on the table and they're rolling and loping, and so I think that there are a lot of questions around sort of part to part considerations, especially if you're doing it over time. And so the question is, well, how much analysis, how much evaluation do you do for your qualification for that particular printer, or whatever you're trying to accomplish, to really try to understand it, because there are differences for sure.
Yeah, especially, and it's a time thing too, right? There's time to test it, time to make the parts and post finish and all of that. Once you start kind of backing out, okay, I need to bring something to market or go through this gate in certification by this amount of time, and all of a sudden your DOE says you need to make 12 builds. Like that could be a few months of time just to get all that together. And so I imagine like that partnership, certainly with companies that aren't as skilled on the material science side, like probably benefit from what you guys see on a day-to-day basis, right? And like you see a lot of different machines and different products. And so that context probably helps a lot in those conversations.
It does. And I guess two key thoughts come to mind. And one is we've talked about just different companies and different cultures. And, if you're asking that, what is the bare minimum sort of question versus I've heard statements like, well, we are just going to add a factor of safety to our design, and we're just going to addedly print it using the basic parameters. So that's fine. You can get to a product, and if that's the approach you want to take, you would do that. But then we have other customers that are, really interested in optimizing every printing parameters, whether it's the laser power settings or the scan speeds or the flow of oxygen, whatever it is, for flow of gas. And you can, if your process isn't robust enough to control that data and that variability, you can get confused very easily. And then you have a lot of data and no ability to backtrack it. So I'm still surprised when, we get batches of parts. There's hundreds of parts, and there's things that are mislabeled, there are things that aren't traceable back to the build plate location, or the labeling methodology is poor. So now you have these parts that we can go ahead and test, and we try to flag this as much as we can. But you're trying to tweak too much, right? And so you kind of have this bare minimum approach. You have this, let's just tweak everything and keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And it's important to kind of stop and ask that question and make sure that you are organized and you have that traceability through down to your test results. And how do you factor that back in and make good decisions, opposed to just tweaking and tweaking and tweaking? Because inevitably, what will happen if you're doing that is, we will, like in the medical space, we will run these spine cages. So typically they have, they're small, they're an inch by half an inch by half an inch or whatever. And, you will have this cool matrix, you'll run through the tests, and it's supposed to get to 5 million cycles without failure. And you're supposed to duplicate that effort. Well, you get one that runs out, one that at 4 million looked fine, and at 5 million, now you've got a crack. And that's a problem because you have to, you're not supposed to have any cracks. So where did that separation come from? It happened at the very end, which you typically don't see. Is it a test artifact? Is it your material? Is it your processing? You start asking questions, and it's always, it's always the test lab's fault. It's like, well, we went and changed all these different parameters, and you're tweaking on the fly and sending stuff. And it's so, I would say it's important to stay organized and be careful what you're tweaking and when, and trying to characterize it. And then, maybe as you're doing that, there's differences in that build plate location. So understanding where you're taking it, and again, having that process where you can track what you're doing and how you're doing it, so you just don't get ahead of yourself thinking you know what you're doing. I'll just tweak, and you really don't know the impact of what it's going to have.
For sure. If only there were a software tool that helped with that.
Yeah, do you know of any?
So kind of a related question, I guess, is we mentioned fatigue and tensile, but one of the other challenges that I see many kind of end users, certainly, and even OEMs who are kind of developing new technology, is like, what body of testing should I do? Or like for the end user, there may be like things on the data sheet that aren't relevant, right? Like it could be, or that just aren't there. A lot of times fatigue is not something that's generally kind of given on a lot of data, like general data sheets for end users, or chemical resistance, or like even other more specific tests like biocompatibility. Like that's a narrow definition, especially on a data sheet from an equipment manufacturer. So it's certainly one of those things that I get a lot of questions about from people. Is like, hey, have you seen testing on parameter X that like isn't on the data sheet? And so how much of your kind of day-to-day work is like doing some of that exploration for companies that like, hey, I just need to know, like conventionally manufactured products need to pass this UV test or a paint chip test or something like that. But you're never going to see that on a data sheet.
Yeah, I mean, it always depends on what the customer is trying to accomplish, and understanding how does this data sheet align to the real world application. Mm-hmm. Right? So the question I ask often is, okay, so what are you trying to prove, and how is this going to fail? So, things fail in fatigue all the time. And particularly in additive, understanding fatigue strength is critical to any application. And I think like in the medical space, and I'll compare medical and aero a little bit, in aerospace, it is, I just bought a new printer. I'm going to run full build volume, test after test after test, tensils, fatigue. I want to know everything about that particular printer before I even get into my qualifications. And then you get into the medical space, and it's like, let's run a tensile, right? And hopefully that'll be enough. We can get away with it because that's our coupon test. And again, I'm not saying that you have to have that same approach in the medical space. But I think it's just interesting because you look at the risks, right? For both of those, you look at kind of the end use, and you're looking at service life. You don't want an airplane to fall out of the sky, right? You really want to understand your materials properties because you're pushing that margin of design. You want to use as little material as possible, and you want to be as strong as possible, right? Whereas something like med device, I mean, you're most of the time your implants are going in there, they're fusing into the body to fix a broken bone or something like that. And in 4, 6, 8, 12 weeks, you might have fusion, and then you either take it out or you leave it in there, and then it doesn't really do anything. And so there's questions around, okay, well, what is your end use? How long do you need it to last for? Do we need it to last for 30 years? No. Do you need to last it for 12 weeks? Probably. So how many times are you going to move your arm? How many steps are you going to take? Or an airplane, how many times are you going to take off and land? And so when it comes to those kinds of questions, it's always, take a look at what your certs say from the material that you're getting or you're generating, but how does that apply to the risks that you have within kind of the end use of what you're doing? And different industries just handle it differently. I always say that medical is 30 years behind aerospace. And part of that is because you talk to the aero guys and they are innovating and creating new alloys left and right all over the place and characterizing new materials and qualifying new vendors. Right? In medical, where we've got titanium, maybe some stainless, maybe some cobalt chrome. TI-64 hasn't changed, right? And so this understanding is, it's biocompatible. This is what everyone uses. This is what we're going to use. And we really don't need to understand the true fatigue performance of this. And then anytime you start adding, you add additive to it, and now you're kind of creating, you've got this powder, you're creating this new material, and you've got all these other variabilities. And I think it's, on one hand, you should know more about the fatigue strength, for example, and understand how you can really push the envelope of that material and align to the stiffness of what you would use in the body, for example, versus just saying, it's titanium.
Sure. And within kind of your organization, your colleagues, and kind of in the testing services piece, I mean, additive it wasn't born yesterday, but it's certainly not an old established technology. And there are likely differences in terms of how things fail or the types of parts you might see to test. Has there been any kind of internal cultural learnings or appreciation for the type of technology or the type of parts you get from 3D printing technology, or any patterns that you're noticing more with the printed parts than you would with conventionally manufactured components? Are there any kind of, I guess, interesting kind of trends or things that you've seen over your time?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's hard to pull trends out when you look at a lot of the different, I guess, business segments. I think one of the things that we were being asked for more and more is, especially with maybe a more mature company or companies that have been doing this for some time, you start building up that database, right? And you understand your trends, you understand how your printers perform, you understand how your parts kind of come off the build plate. And I think there's some maybe clear shifts to more of, and I'm not a stats guy, but towards statistical process control, and saying, okay, we've run X amount of tests with a high degree of certainty. We can say, these are sort of the thresholds that we're looking for, and then take a look at the data behind that, and then either start backing off or kind of create these are our trigger limits for when something is going wrong. So I think I would say across the industries, we've seen maybe some questions around that. And how do we sort of, can Element support something like that? And the answer is yes, and it depends on what each customer is looking for. So that's maybe one of the things that stands out. Let me think about if there's anything else.
So would that kind of align as well to the, like, because you're building things layer upon layer, right? And say there's a bad layer in this and you pull the tensor bar and like it breaks right at that layer. Like, are you able to connect some of that information or insight, or is most of the information you see kind of in a vacuum? You see, okay, it failed. This one was lower.
Yeah.
I don't exactly know why, or
I made this point a little bit earlier, but it's hard because it differs from customer to customer.
right.
You can make an observation, but you don't necessarily know what they did on the other side to cause that, right? So maybe they had a heat treating issue, right? Or maybe they had a hipping issue, whatever it is. Maybe they changed something, and so typically, like within the medical space, some of those observations probably come back in terms of sort of FDA feedback or response. So you go and you kind of submit on the product side, and then all of a sudden you see a question pop up, and then you see another question. You start seeing some of those trends because they're either seeing clinical failures or they've identified something different. And so once you start getting 2 or 3 kind of responses back against questions, then you pivot and say, okay, well, we're seeing feedback come like this, therefore, to the customer, don't do this, or let's take a look at this, or something like that. So I'd say we see it maybe from the opposite end coming back. And then it's also hard because customers have different requirements internally. So, this aerospace prime and this medical prime are just going to have different schools of thoughts and things that they're doing. So we try to stay ahead of it as much as we can. I think that's why it's helpful to kind of take a step back into the standards and try to take a look at what's going on, apply those thinking patterns to it, and try to sort of standardize that approach. But customers are going to do what customers are going to do.
And what makes, in kind of your opinion, a successful customer engagement in these types of kind of additive manufacturing testing endeavors or projects?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. I think it starts with communication and being able to say, look, here is, what is it that you need? Do you just need a turnkey service where you don't really want to engage and you just need the results because you know what you're doing? Or if you don't, here is, how can we work together? So we've been able to implement different models where, obviously a lot of our testing is fee for service. You need a tensile bar, you send us tensile bar, we test them, that's it. But what we found successful was we've had conversations with customers, and they're saying, well, we're really looking to accelerate our R&D. What kind of models can we implement in order to kind of help accelerate that, to cut those lead times down? Can we get priority? Can we get dedicated capacity? Can you come in and run our lab for us? Can you build a lab on site for us? All things that Element has experience with. And I would say it comes back down to asking the question and the willingness of the customers to tell us what their needs are and what's important. Some customers, all they care about is lead time. They want that thing done as soon as possible, as fast as possible, right? And they're saying the spec says 5 hertz, 10 million cycles, and they're like, can we run it faster? Can we run it faster? Can we run it faster? No, well, you can, but then you're going to have to answer some questions. And other customers really want to take their time and understand, this is what we're looking for. Here's what we're trying to figure out. So I think upfront communicating and asking questions around what is it that you need and how can we align to the culture that's sort of at your company. I think making time to ask some questions really transforms how the project will go.
And who is the typical kind of contact or like person that you'd be engaging with? Is it a test engineer? Is it a mechanical engineer? Is it a program manager? Kind of who usually engages in these conversations?
Yeah, so I would say it depends on where you are in the process. So a lot of our work is R&D support, so we're working mainly with the R&D folks, and oftentimes, we kind of build up relationships between our project managers and their R&D folks, and over time you get to know the customer and how they function, what they like, what they don't like. We also do a lot of work with quality engineers and the folks on the quality side, especially if you're looking at process validation or production validation. Then it's usually the quality or the manufacturing folks. And then over the last 12 months, maybe, especially as COVID has hit, obviously sort of revenues take a hit across all of the industries, and it's really starting to come back. But we've seen a lot more involvement with procurement groups that are, being hired in or brought internal, and they're asking the question, well, how do we, right now, if you go and you want to perform this test versus this test versus this test, you've got 10 different vendors. Well, there's some cost efficiencies if you can consolidate under a single vendor, like Element, for example. We can leverage some size, some geographic footprint, some risk mitigation, some overall experience. And so I'd say over the last 12 months, we've definitely seen a lot more engagement from procurement, and ultimately engineering and quality has sort of the final say. But we're starting to see a lot more involvement from them.
That's interesting. So does that make it challenging in terms of discussing like the benefits of certain tests or certain capabilities with folks that may not be experienced with tensile testing or fatigue testing?
It does, right? Because I mean, if you test a cobalt chrome, that requires low stress grind tensile test versus a titanium or something else, it takes more time. So there can be, price differences between things like that. And so the procurement groups aren't necessarily technical. They're asking questions around, well, we need an apples to apples comparison so we can competitively bid this and so forth. And that can be a bit of extra work. And it's, again, not things that we're not willing to participate in, but and it just depends. If they're really looking just to save costs, that's one thing. But if they see value, I had another conversation earlier today with a procurement group that really enjoys working with our team, and they see opportunity. They see opportunity to sort of expand with Element. Element's able to grow and scale alongside of them. They've got some really big projects coming up, so they're asking questions like, how can we set this up so that we've got a defined 3-year relationship, and what commitments can we get in order to make sure that we have the capacity when we need it. And so when you have someone like that internally, even though they're not technical, that can actually accelerate some of the discussions, because you kind of skip over maybe the local R&D or quality hurdles, and you jump right into, let's talk a big picture, long-term strategic relationship.
Right. And I like to always ask the guests I have on to help educate other people who are thinking about different careers related to additive manufacturing and the 3D printing industry. Like, what does your average day look like in terms of working at Element, and even representative pre or post COVID, whatever it may be? But kind of, can you speak to a little bit about that?
Sure. So I'm an engineer at heart. So I like to problem solve. I'd say most of my job on a day-to-day basis is some form of problem solving. So, in my current role, I have a technical responsibility. After we finish up here, I've got to go write some summaries to go to FDA for regulatory purposes, based on some testing that was done in my expertise. Earlier today, I was working on a variety of marketing content to try to support and provide some information education to some things that we think are important. A lot of emails. It's always emails, right? And then it just depends on sort of the customers that have questions that particular day, and trying to, for me, it's a lot of fun being in the testing part, because it's something that's sort of tactile and physical, and you can work on. And most of the time, our longest projects run a couple of months, typically maybe 6 months max for a long running test. And a lot of them are less than, 30 days or so. So it's kind of high turnover, and you get to learn a lot. You get to see a lot of different things. I'll get an email from an inquiry that wants to know, have you ever seen or done or anything like this? And then we'll have, let's design the regulatory strategy for submitting this type of implant. And you get to be at the forefront of sort of what technology is out there, and you get a lot of questions. And then, especially if you can leverage that and take it back to the standards committees and drive sort of those changes and discussions, that just makes it a lot of fun. So my favorite part is learning about the customers and the technology that they have, for sure. There's a lot of unique things that are out there, and then trying to figure out how can we partner with them in order to take what we do and provide a solution, not just for that one piece, but sort of a long-term R&D partnership.
Right. And it sounds like too, like foreign people, they stereotype engineers as folks that don't write or communicate, but it sounds like your main job is kind of communicate, or one of your main jobs is communicating results, talking to regulatory boards and writing up kind of items and documents for specific audiences for specific purposes. If you don't communicate it correctly, like there could be a question, it could cause delays, it could be ambiguity, and so that's probably a really key piece of your work.
It is, and I would say to engineers or just that are exploring some of these fields. I mean, I'd say those are some of the everyone's excited to go in there and problem solve and design, right? Design. But then you start looking at, well, how do you communicate that design to your manufacturing? How do you communicate with quality? How do you communicate with your external vendors? And I think that sort of that communication piece and that transfers into the writing piece as well, right? Because you've got procedures, you've got requirements, you've got certs, you've got all kinds of other stuff. It takes some time to develop those things, and I would say even opportunities like this to be able to share some of my experience. And again, I appreciate you having me and chatting here. But you kind of got to stick yourself out there and say, you know what, let's take a look at what I've been doing, what's working, what's not working. As you take that step back, then you have something to go and talk about, which I think makes it interesting.
Absolutely. And so kind of in the coming months, what are you excited about? What are AMUG's coming up? You guys are actually at the booth right next to me in Orlando. So I'll see you down there, but kind of are there anything exciting coming up, or any kind of educational pieces that people should check out on Related Element or some of the testing that you guys are doing?
Yeah, so www.element.com, you can find a lot of information there. If you go /medical devices, you'll see the work that we're doing there. I'm excited to go to AMUG. It's been a long time since I've been at a trade show or event in person, so I think it'll just be good to kind of get into that loop. And I'm excited to see how the fall opens up with travel and some of the vaccine rollout and things like that. So that's exciting. I'd say maybe from a capabilities perspective, sort of two newer exciting things have come to Element through acquisition. One is learning a lot more about the regulatory space and the regulatory consulting. That's something that we're going to be able to offer. And historically, we've sort of stayed out of that space, but that's something that's really exciting. We get a lot of questions for support, maybe a more formal matter interaction with FDA, and that's something that's relatively new for us. And then I think the other part is, again, coming to us through acquisition, is around extractables and leachables and chemical characterization. So within the biocompatibility piece, we had mentioned that earlier, you have sort of the animal testing components, but then you also have this big push, particularly with EU MDR out of Europe, around chemical characterization testing. So those are two kind of big bolt-ons that we have as part of our capabilities. That's something that I'm really excited about to see how that can grow and continue to provide value for our customers.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for the conversation today, and we'll talk to you in person soon.
Great, Mike. Thanks a lot.
Great.